Thank you on behalf of the Commissioner and the Governor for allowing Indiana to speak with you today. Based on what Mike and Brett have talked about, I'd really like to dive into a little bit more of the mechanics behind Indiana's performance funding formula. You'll hear terms used different ways: outcomes-based funding, performance-based funding, performance funding formula. It's all pretty much the same. Indiana has been, as Mike and Brett has mentioned, a leader in this area, and we really do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. In addition, because our formula is really based on completion, I think this ties in well with the discussion that we're having this morning. Just an overview of our budget, because I'm a budget guy and have been doing this for a long time. Indiana does operate on a biennial budget system, so our formula is based on this and is set in place for 2 years. So there's not a lot of changes that go on within our formula once it's passed by the General Assembly. This is just to show you a little bit of all the different players we have in the budget development process and how it impacts our performance formula. Everything from the institutions themselves and the presidents, to the members of their General Assembly, to the governor, to the commission itself, and others. And so there's a lot of different players that are touching not only the funding of higher education, but also the performance funding formula itself. In terms of our performance funding, as Mike mentioned, historically, prior to 2003, Indiana was heavily based on enrollment funding. To use a similar comparable structure, it's the K-12 funding model that we have in Indiana or in other states, where it's based on, pardon the language, but butts in the seats. So the more you grow the butts in the seats, the more money you get. And when you've got new money, you're bringing in more dollars to your institution. In 2003, that changed a little bit because, as, again, Mike mentioned, I think I'm basically reiterating most of what Mike said, our major research campuses, Purdue, West Lafayette, and IU Bloomington, saw their enrollment stabilize. So they weren't winning in the old enrollment formula as our other growing regional campuses and community campuses or community colleges were. So therefore, they were looking for other ways to gain in state funding, but outside of enrollment. So in 2003, the state said, let's give you an incentive based on how much research expenditures you have year over year and reward you if that number grows. And so this was the first actual performance-based metric that was in Indiana's funding of higher education in 2003. Today, we have 7 distinct metrics that are part of our formula that reward institutions based on 3 major areas and really do focus on completion, progression of the student through their high school career, and productivity. One of the interesting parts about Indiana is there is no statutory authority, law, or code that requires this. This is really a policy that was developed by the Commission in collaboration with the legislature and the governor to really try to incentivize performance outcomes in institutions. This gives the state of Indiana a lot of flexibility when it comes to how much money to put in the formula, the metrics to use in the formula, how to weight the formula. Other states have passed legislation, as you may know, that requires a certain percentage be set in place. This really gives the state a lot of flexibility. If revenues aren't coming in, if the funding isn't there, it gives the General Assembly and policymakers a lot of discretion on what the formula looks like based on the realities politically and financially. Also, in terms of funding the formula, as was mentioned earlier, there are different ways of doing this. If there's new money, it's great. If there's no money, that's a tough decision to make. Historically, as we've talked about, performance funding was simply based on new dollars. In the last couple of years, that has not been the case, and especially in Indiana. I apologize for the small font, but this is a matrix of what our formula has looked like over the last 12 years. And this, I'll get into some details in a little bit, but this is basically to show you several things. Number one, our formula changed every biennium. One of the big things we heard about our formula, not only from our institutions but from other entities, is formulas need to stay the same and the metrics need to stay the same year over year. If you're changing it every year, you're going to have problems with institutions reacting to how you're grading them and reacting to how you're rewarding them. This also shows that we moved away significantly in 2009 away from enrollment-based funding. But we also progressively move through changing how we fund higher education. You'll notice that the red area is the new performance metrics that occurred in that biennium. And as you can see, as we added some of the red metrics or the new metrics in 2007, we kept some of the old funding in place. And in fact, in 2009, while we have enrollment change being successfully completed, not enrolled, we actually had a hybrid where we did 10% based on enrollment on successfully completed and 90% based on enrollment actually in the institution. So we created a hybrid to try to soften the blow of the new performance funding model being set in place. But the takeaway on this is, again, two things. Keeping the formula the same, and number two, if you do implement, it may take some time based on your state's priorities and goals. I think that gets to the fact where really working with multiple policymakers and institutions as you develop this is a key component of developing a successful performance-based model in your state. For the 2011-13 biennium, we did fund higher education performance funding at 5%. This was the largest percent allocation for performance funding that Indiana has seen since its inception in 2003. And that represented roughly about $61 million. The way that we allocated those dollars was based on the metrics that were set in place during that year and how the Commission and then the General Assembly weighted those metrics during the budget process. One of the two main things that we took out of this is while we allocated dollars to the metrics and the metrics showed a certain result which then calculated into dollars to the institution, several of our institutions saw negative results. They had a drop in degree production, a drop in their on-time graduation rate. Because in 2011-13 we did an across-the-board reduction to create a pool for performance funding, we only rewarded positive results. We did not penalize institutions that had negative results. In the past, when there was new money, we would reduce an institution's appropriation because of negative results, but because there was no new money in 2011-13, we felt that that would be inappropriate and really be a double hit, a real disincentive to an institution to be taken, have 5% taken away, and then lose based on negative results. So we really focused on positive results in the formula in 2011-13. As I mentioned here, we did do a 5% allocation across the base. A lot of states, as you may hear, if there's no money, they abandon performance funding. They don't want to hurt the base of the institutions. Other states, Tennessee, Ohio, have gone to 100%, but since Indiana's kind of in the middle, the question was really, do we want to fund performance funding? Do we really want to continue this, or do we want to hold everybody harmless because there's no new money? Our commission, with the support of our governor and our General Assembly, felt it was important to continue this. So therefore, we took 5% across the board evenly from every institution, set aside a pool, and then rewarded it to the institutions. The interesting part of this is the amount of money that we set aside in 2011-13 compared to previous years. This was the largest percentage the state had set aside since the inception. And this really goes to the impact of your formula that on the institutions, really driving them to improve completion, improve attainment, improve productivity and progression. 1%, $12.3 million, as Mike mentioned in Illinois, it's 0.5%. It doesn't make institutions change. 1% is not much. 12 million spread between 17 distinct campuses in Indiana doesn't mean much. But when it's $61 million and it's being cut out of their base, you get some attention. And in a bit, I'll show you the reaction we got from some of the institutions. The other interesting thing to take away from this is I've gotten the question a lot of times, especially from folks from NCHIMS, is, okay, you've had performance funding formula, or you've had performance-based funding for a long time. Have you improved completion? Have you improved productivity? Have you improved on-time graduation rates? Well, at those percentages, it's not the performance funding formula that's doing that. It's the enrollment growth that we saw in Indiana between 2007 and 2010 that drove our completion rate numbers up, that drove our on-time graduation rate numbers up. Our hope, as we stabilize at a higher percentage in our performance funding and stabilize the metrics that we use, that we see completion numbers continue to change and grow based on performance funding rather than enrollment. This is just a graphical representation of the previous chart. As you can see, again, a low amount of percentage in the performance funding, and then a pretty significant jump in 2011-13 for our overall. Since its inception, all the dollars going towards performance funding compared to the 2011-13 appropriation represents almost 12% of the dollars going to higher education based on some type of performance-based outcome measure. Our current metrics that are in place now, and I'll go over the metrics that we are recommending for the next biennium, but the current metrics in place now are basically our overall degree completion, how many degrees do you produce year over year, low-income student degree completion, and this is the point that Mike made earlier about focusing on at-risk students, Pell recipient students. That's exactly what this does. And if you talk to anybody in this area, you've got to have this in your formula. It is important for access. It's important to make sure that there's no cherry picking. It's a vital metric in the formula. Successful completion of credit hours, simply improving the number of credit hours students complete. We also incentivize dual credit or dual enrollment at the high school setting, and we reward our institutions on that. Change in the on-time graduation rate, both 2 and 4 year. We do not do a 6-year graduation rate. This is on-time graduation rate. And then the research incentive that was discussed earlier was still a part of this. I will note that our metrics only judge resident students. We do not use data for out-of-state or reciprocity. These metrics are aligned to the state's goals to improve Hoosier attainment and Hoosier completion. So we only focus on resident undergraduate students. The formula that we have in place today that is funded focuses only on associate's and bachelor's degrees. We changed that, as I'll discuss earlier. And then again, dual credit was focused only on dual credit taken at the high school setting. We did all this great work, and I walked into my job, and I thought I had this great formula put in place, and the wise people in the legislature said, wait a minute, let's take another look at this. And 9 months into the job, I thought, man, I was going to have this easy. Indiana's leading it, and again, they said, no. You've changed it too much. I go back to the matrix you saw earlier. It's changed too much. Let's fund it the way it is today. But let's take a look at it. Let's send you back and let's talk to other states. Let's talk to some major players in this. Let's talk to the institutions, and let's see how we can make our formula, number one, a solid formula based on mission differentiation, and two, one that will not change over time. And so again, as I mentioned, we don't have the legislature mandating our formula, but at this point they said, look, we won't mandate it for now. But we will ask you to go back and take a look at it and report back to us. And so in 2011, the General Assembly requested us to do that, and we did that. The next few slides talk about what Indiana did to look at a new performance model, to get feedback from institutions, and go out and talk to folks. And as you'll hear, as you heard from, or excuse me, as you probably have heard from states like Tennessee, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Washington, this isn't an overnight thing. This is really something that you have to talk to a lot of different people. And so we started in the summer of 2011, and for 7 months, talked to university presidents, talked to institution CFOs, talked to different states. We hired an outside consultant, HCM strategist, to develop a report that looked at Ohio, Tennessee, and Washington and what they were doing, and some of the issues that might arise in our current funding formula. So this is just a little bit of a history of the steps we took, again, working with our university presidents. We then worked with HCM to provide analysis of what was going on in other states and provided a report. In September of 2011, our staff and our office began putting together some metrics that we had heard from the presidents, and met with our university CFOs and other staff to make sure that they were comfortable with these figures. We also actually had a collaborative session with our HCM strategist, and actually brought in members of the legislature, university presidents, governor's staff, policymakers, and Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Washington to have a all-afternoon meeting to talk only about performance funding. And it was very helpful for them. They really got a good understanding of where we were going. Finally, we came up with a list of metrics in the winter of 2011 in December. And based on all the collaboration discussions we had, we felt that we wanted to focus our metrics in 3 key areas: completion, progression, and productivity. And interestingly, those are the 3 main areas of our state's higher education strategic plan. As Mike mentioned, it's great to create a performance funding formula, but you've got to align it with state goals and state priorities. So while our office was not only developing a new performance funding model, it was also developing a new strategic plan. So the two work together to align our strategic plan with our metrics. Within our metrics, or within our 3 areas of completion, progression, and productivity, we have 7 metrics. That's it, 7, simple. If you've heard about South Carolina, and Mike spoke about it, it was very complex. We have 7 distinct metrics that we feel not only focus on the state's priorities and goals, but also on mission differentiation. Overall degree completion, at-risk student, which is also the low-income student. High impact is new, focuses on STEM. For progression, we have student persistence, or the benchmarks that both Brent and Mike talked about. Remediation success, first time we've ever incentivized remediation success. We've kept our on-time graduation rate metric. We actually added a new metric called the institution-defined productivity metric, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but this is actually one that's selected by the universities and colleges, not by us. Just some detail behind each of the metrics, and I'll go through this quickly, but just to give you some detail. For these completion metrics, for overall degree completion metrics, at risk and high impact, there's one thing we want to note about this. There is no time requirement for this. It could take a student 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, 20 years. It counts. If you get that degree, you get to count it in the column. This really incentivizes overall completion. Adult learners, part-time, full-time. It really doesn't discriminate against the type of student. It just says get more degrees produced by your institutions. It focuses on everything from one-year certificates all the way to doctoral degrees. I will make a side note that our medical school is not included in this. For at-risk students, again, Pell recipients when they graduate, but it only focuses on certificates, associates, and bachelor degrees. We think that for this metric to include doctoral and master's degrees would be inappropriate. And then high impact. You'll notice that our research incentive metric went away. And the research incentive metric was really geared towards expenditures by the university. Well, how does that promote student outcomes and student performance? That's you spending money on research. Yes, it can have an impact, but it's not a direct impact. So we removed the research component, but we put in high impact, and we said this is only for our research institutions, and this incentivizes improvement in STEM degrees. And the STEM degree listing is a hybrid of the Complete College America STEM degree listing and the National Science Foundation, and focuses on bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees. For our progression metrics, this is really focusing on getting the student through, not in a timely manner, but getting the student through, getting that student to progress up to a 15, 30, or 45 credit hour benchmark in the community colleges, and a 30 and 60 hour credit benchmark in our non-research 4-year campuses. Again, no time requirement, but simply saying if you get a student to move through the system and hit these benchmarks, you can win in the formula. For remediation success, this was a new metric again, and we wanted to incentivize remediation, but we didn't want to incentivize remediation just by passing the remediation course. You had to pass the remediation course and pass the next credit-bearing gateway course. You had to hit 2 benchmarks in order for this to count. This was a big eye-opener for a lot of people. They were funding remediation the old way. This is a different way. The interesting thing about this metric is we were originally going to judge this by head count. How many heads did you actually have getting through remediation and gateway, and did you see an improvement on that? We did. In the raw data, the numbers went up. But what was interesting is when you compared the number of students that got through both remediation and gateway back to the original number of students requiring to get remediation in that cohort, the ratio dropped over time. The enrollment growth was so great at our community colleges, and by the way, this remediation metric is only at our community colleges. The growth in enrollment was so great and remediation needs were so great that while the headcount numbers went up, the ratio went down. So we decided that this metric is still important to us, but we're not going to fund it because nobody performed well in this metric. Still an incentive, still a metric out there, but interestingly enough, we saw something and said, we're still going to promote this, but community colleges really need to get that ratio up. And finally, our on-time graduation rate and our productivity metrics. On-time graduation rate, making sure that students graduate in both 2 and 4 years at our 2 and 4 year institutions. The institution-defined productivity metric, again, is a metric that the institution got to select based on 2 criteria. One, the metric was aligned with the strategic plan or strategic goals of the institution. Number 2, it reduces the cost of attendance to the students. In all honesty, and since I'm in a group of people that I think I can trust, this is the Achilles heel of our formula right now because each institution got to select their own metric. That's like asking each of you what you want for dinner. I only have one menu and one chef. It's going to be tough. Each institution came back with something different. It was good. It was interesting. difficult to make a comparison between the institutions. We're still working on this, but this is a really good way to get the institution's skin in the game, to let them select a metric that's aligned with what their institutional goals are, but also with reducing the cost of attendance to the student. This is a matrix of the metrics that I just listed, and again, mission differentiation being the key component of our formula. You'll note that we have our three categories: research campus, four-year non-research campus, and two-year. Not every campus gets to participate in each metric. Our research campuses don't participate in persistence and do not participate in remediation. Our state's goal is to get remediation at the two-year colleges and two-year universities, period. Next is students that are attending major, highly ranked Carnegie classified research campuses should not have a problem with persistence. It should be getting them out and graduated and getting them out on time and focusing on high impact degrees. For our four-year campuses, they shouldn't be doing remediation, but they also shouldn't be focused on high impact degrees. We agree, they produce STEM related degrees, but we also know that our four-year non-research campuses have more part-time students, more adult students. Producing high impact degrees and STEM degrees is great for them, but they've got to get their completion rates up, they've got to get their on-time graduation rates up, and as I said, their persistence is important. That's why they participate. In our two-year institutions, the only metric they do not participate in is high impact. I agree. There's a lot of workforce certificates out there, one-year certificates, associates that are really focused on STEM. Studies out there that a STEM associate degree can potentially earn you more than a bachelor's degree. But the point is, our two-year campuses really need to focus on remediation, persistence, and completion. I'll go into a little bit of the mechanics, and this is the financial brain of me and testifying before many legislative committees. The more I dive into the numbers, the more I see glazed faces, so I won't dive into this as much as I was going to. But as was mentioned earlier, we currently are at 5%. We are going to advocate that the the General Assembly move to 6% of performance funding in 2014 and 7% in 2015, moving that needle even more. There were members of our commission that wanted to go to 20%. Very aggressive. May have even sunk the boat with the legislature. So we suggest a slow movement towards performance-based funding. The weighting of each of the metrics is based on the commission, but ultimately that decision is up to the General Assembly. In terms of continuing the policy of moving the performance funding formula forward, again, we note 6 and 7%. The question is, how will that be funded? This biennium, we took an across-the-board 5% allocation from each of the institutions. This coming biennium, we need to look at how we are going to fund this. We could ask for brand new money, but I don't know any state, and there's a lot of them here, that are going to give a 6% and 7% increase to higher education, brand new right off the bat, when you've got Medicaid, K-12, and other issues you're dealing with. I also know that the institutions really feel that it's an impact on them that if they've lost 5% last biennium and they're going to lose 6% and 7% the next biennium, you're really hurting a lot of base funding and potentially impact tuition and fees. That's why we're looking at a hybrid approach that takes a small percentage out of the base and adds new money to create a pool for performance funding. This will still impact the base, but not as much as what we would expect. Also, Indiana is committed to, both on the legislative and the commission side, that any new dollars that go to higher education operating goes via the performance funding, not into the base. This is just a graphical representation of how we allocate our formula. Out of the $1.1 billion available, we would put 6% or $66 million into 2014 and roughly 7% or $77 million in 2015. And would allocate them based on the three major areas of our formula. The weighting of the formula specifically, and again, this is into more of the mechanics of it that many of maybe your commissions or boards work on. The formula is really driven by how much money you put into each metric, which then rewards each institution. If I could put $77 million in the middle of the rotunda at the State House in Indiana and played a cannonball run with the institutions, that would be much more entertaining than this, trust me. But it's not the best way of doing it. So we have to weight each metric, assign a dollar amount, and then how the institution did in each of those metrics rewards them dollars. This weighting is not done in a vacuum. It's done with our commission, it's done with our institutions. The commission makes the recommendation to the General Assembly. And then the General Assembly will then look at that weighting and say, is that appropriate? The General Assembly will then decide what that is. But fortunately, we have a wonderful working relationship with our legislators, and especially those on House Ways and Means and our appropriations. And if there's ever a change in the weighting that impacts the formula, we look at every scenario before that's done. And so, again, because the weighting isn't in state law or isn't in code, there's flexibility, there's fungibility in our formula. Again, a graphical representation of the way our formula currently is being proposed. Again, the $1.1 billion allocated $66 million and $77 million for each year of the biennium. Currently, we are proposing that 55% of the dollars go towards completion or degree attainment metrics, 15% to progression metrics, and 30% to productivity metrics. I will note that of all of the individual metrics which are in green there, the change in degree and the on-time graduation rate represent 55% of the money going out to institutions. That tells the institutions the state's priorities is on-time graduation rate and completion. The other metrics are important, but it has historically been that Indiana's priorities and goals are to improve completion and to improve attainment. Therefore, more than half of our formula in just two metrics. If you add the other degree change metrics, you're up to a higher percentage. I tried to do the math, I couldn't. You're up to a much higher percentage going to just overall completion and on-time graduation. Let me end with two quick things, the policy impact and policy considerations. As I noted, too little funding in the formula results in no change. 1%, 2%, my former state that I worked in as well as Mike, 0.5% doesn't do anything. Higher percentages create results, Tennessee, Ohio. The 5% that we set aside in 2012 and 2013 may not have been a lot, but it did result in some actions by our institutions. We saw institutions lower their summer school tuition rates to incentivize students to come back in the summer and take classes to complete and maybe even graduate on time. Purdue University is looking at a year-round program. It's going to take time to do that, but they're going to look at year-round to have students graduate in 3 years. We also have accelerated degree programs at our 2-year institutions and at our 4-year institutions have students graduate with associates in 1 year and bachelors in 3 years. Several institutions have instituted scholarships to graduate on time, $500, $1,000. If you get done in 4 years, here's a check or a reduction in your student debt, depending on your situation. Indiana University has made an announcement that it will freeze tuition for a sophomore going into their junior and senior year who is on track to graduate within 4 years and has their course mapping set up. First time that this has been done within the state of Indiana. Also, legislation was passed last time that limits the number of credit hours to 120 credit hours for 4 years and 68 credit hours for 2 years, with exceptions for professional degree programs or work-related programs that require more credit hours. The state, we call it the credit creep bill. So the state has set that law, and also institutions, specifically Ball State, says if you take more than 144 credit hours, which, as the gentleman I know sitting in the back, if you don't get done in 4 years, you got to figure out a way to pay for it in your 5th year. If you take more than 144 credit hours, we will charge you a premium for every additional credit hour taken. Again, an incentive to improve completion and improve on time. Again, as we move to a 6 and 7%, our focus is the big goal. Many of you may have heard that. The Lumina study, the Lumina Foundation, 60% by 2025. We are currently, I think, at 41. These are things that are trying to get us towards that 60%. You've heard this from both Mike and Brett. I won't lean on it too much, but again, these are some things you should consider as you go back to your states. Aligning the priorities of the state with your strategic plans for higher education and your performance funding. Keep the formula, the metrics simple. Focus on major indicators. Data is key. Data is the linchpin of performance-based funding. If you don't have good data, sorry, it's really important. Collaboration with your various stakeholders. Look at several years of data. Don't just look at 1 or 2 years of change. Keep the formula and the metrics in place. You can adjust them, tweak them a little bit, but keep the goals of the formula and the metrics in place. And again, as mentioned before, the levels of funding differ state by state. Your state may be different. Your state may want to do a progressive approach, 5%, 6%, 7%. Again, Ohio, Tennessee have been doing this for much longer. They can go to 100%. But be careful. It can become a slippery slope if you move too fast. With that, thank you very much.